Okay, wir warten noch ein wenig auf die noch Eintreffenden und auf die Audiosignale, dass sie sich verbinden können. Nur ein paar Sekunden und dann geht es auch schon los. Und ich möchte Sie erstmal ganz herzlich begrüßen heute Abend zum Transatlantic Tuesday des Carl-Schurz-Hauses. Mein Name ist René Freudenthal aus dem Kulturprogramm des Deutsch-Amerikanischen Instituts. Ich begleite Sie heute durch unseren Abend mit Stephen Wertheim und seinem druckfrischen Buch Tomorrow, the World, The Birth of US Global Supremacy. Ganz kurz zur Technik, lassen Sie Ihre Mikrofone bitte ausgeschaltet, damit die Audioqualität gewährleistet wird. Am Ende gibt es die Möglichkeit, noch ein paar Fragen zu stellen. Dr. Stephen Wertheim, bisher Direktor für Grand Strategy am Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft und seit heute Senior Fellow im Programm für American Statecraft am Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, dreht in seinem Buch Tomorrow the World, das er uns heute am Transatlantic Tuesday vorstellt, unser bisheriges Verständnis der Entstehung der globalen Vorherrschaft Amerikas um. Seine bahnbrechende, detailverliebte neue Geschichte der Jahre 1940 bis 1945 erklärt, wie und warum die USA, während sie sich auf ihren Eintritt in den Zweiten Weltkrieg vorbereiteten, beschlossen, entgegen ihres langjährigen Selbstbilds als stolze Demokratie jenseits schmutziger Power Politics aus der alten Welt die Nachkriegswelt anzuführen. Woher haben die Vereinigten Staaten den Willen zu diesem Supermachtsprojekt erlangt? Wie kam es, dass souveräne Dominanz zur selbstverständlichen Pose der politischen Elite Amerikas wurde? Während des weitgehendsten Teils seiner Geschichte hat Amerikas vermieden, politische und militärische Verpflichtungen einzugehen, die es in Machtpolitik nach europäischem Vorbild verwickelt hätten. Doch dann fanden sich die USA plötzlich in einer neuen Rolle als bewaffneter Hegemon der Welt wieder und schauten nie wieder zurück. Tomorrow the World ist ein Werk brillanter, origineller Geschichtsschreibung, das die Art und Weise verändern wird, wie wir über Vergangenheit, Gegenwart und Zukunft des Westens nachdenken. Stephen Wertheim ist spezialisiert auf US-Außenbeziehungen und internationale Ordnung vom 19. Jahrhundert bis zur Gegenwart. Er lehrte an der New Yorker Columbia University, ist derzeit Visiting Research Scholar am Center for Global Legal Challenges an der Yale Law School. Wertheim schreibt regelmäßig Essays, unter anderem im New Yorker, im Foreign Affairs und Foreign Policy, und das renommierte Prospect Magazine nannte ihn einen der 50 wichtigsten Denker für das Zeitalter von Covid-19. Welcome, Stephen. It's an honor you're here with us.
Thank you so much for having me, and good evening, and thanks to everyone who has joined us today.
So your book chronicles, of course, a lot of things, but especially the pivotal years of America deciding it needs to lead the world as a force for good after the Second World War. And you write it as a decisive break with past traditions and its former view of itself. You do it in a very sober, detailed, and nuanced way, I think. But from a German perspective, and I'd like to start with that because myself and most of the people attending will be Germans, it is kind of breathtaking how much of a sense of contingency the story has. So Germans learn, of course, in public school, and from then on, the story is as if it's foretold in the Bible, basically. The Americans enter the war in the end. They defeat the Nazis, they free the people, as it's now called in Germany, of course, and that was always bound to happen. It could never have happened any other way. That's like the deep sense that's inspired in us, I think. So I was wondering, before you began researching and writing the book, did you have this strong sense of contingency already? Is it a difference in the American view of the war, or how was it for you?
No, it's funny. I think the American view is rather similar to what you just described. The view is that the United States was once isolationist, quote unquote, certainly in the 1930s, if not earlier. The view is that the United States was extremely reluctant to get involved in the looming war. That's true. And then there was a battle between basically two camps in the United States, one of them internationalists, the other isolationists. And it was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941 that finally roused the United States to action and to break out of its isolationist shell and fully participate in global politics. And so that narrative too, although it acknowledges that the United States was not seeking global power prior to the war, also makes it seem like the United States had no other choice and inevitably had to enter the war, and not only enter the war, you might say, but become the preeminent political and military actor on a global scale for long after the war.
Actually, maybe because you write the story so close to reality and so detailed, and I would say pretty far away from heroic myths that also connect to the story very easily, my mind kept wandering to fictional depictions of alternative outcomes of the story. I'm sure you know Robert Harris's novel Fatherland, which has also become a movie. There's, of course, The Man in the High Castle, which is now a pretty terrible Amazon series as well, where the Nazis won the war, of course, and even came to America and got most of it. And I was wondering if writing this book and getting so deep into this story in every curve of the road, you could say, if you imagine things coming out a different way, because you of course say that how tiny the American the Department of State was at that time, and the military wasn't like a far shot from what it's now. So did that went to your mind?
Yeah, I think things could have gone differently. So if the Axis powers had not conquered France and ruled Europe for a brief period of time, raising the specter of Eurasia united under Axis leadership, that might not have caused the United States to be willing to abandon all pretense of neutrality, which it did starting in the fall of 1940. And might not have led the United States to recalculate its role in the world generally, and then project power, military power beyond the Western Hemisphere thereafter. What I think isn't possible or isn't plausible counterfactually are some of the more fanciful notions that you referenced, the notion that the United States might have ended up pro-Nazi. That was not even a significant view among those Americans who didn't want to enter the war prior to Pearl Harbor. So I think that's a kind of polemical point meant to give a warning to Americans in the present. So, you know, then again, you could ask, perhaps other circumstances would have caused the United States to take something like the role that it did, perhaps just later in the war. That's all very possible. I'm limited as a historian to what actually happened, but I do think, because I tried to really focus on causality, not just describe what happened, but to give a causal account of what actually prompted the United States to recalculate its role in the world. The analysis does open up this kind of interesting line of thought.
In the pre-story, in a way, to the actual story of those few years in the war where America decided its future role, that you explain that isolationism as this big concept, which has been talked about a lot over the last 4 years, of course, where it's gotten its great comeback under the previous administration, that it has in a way never really existed, but has been constructed from hindsight with the idea to serve an argument, which was coming from the side of what you call, I think, new internationalists and people who try to reframe an idea of American internationalism from the past and make it fit for what they wanted to do in the future. And I was wondering if you could explain how you arrived there while getting into the archives, and also if you had to reconcile this with the many previous histories that have been written about this period, because of course it's a intensely studied period of time. And I was wondering if you could believe what you found, basically, if I could put it that way.
Yeah, so the way I actually got to it was I had done some research on World War I, on debates in the United States about what kind of role America should play coming out of that war, different ideas for a League of Nations, for an international organization. And I realized that despite all the narratives written by scholars about how, you know, there was a struggle between Woodrow Wilson and the internationalists on the one hand, and their opponents, the isolationists, on the other hand, that just wasn't the way that the actors at the time saw it at all. Most participants, at least, well, many of them certainly, saw themselves as internationalists, but for them, internationalism meant seeking to transcend power politics. It didn't mean what is so common in the United States today, that the United States believes it should project power on a global scale, be responsible for enforcing world order. That wasn't what Woodrow Wilson had in mind, and it wasn't what other internationalists had in mind. And in fact, a lot of internationalists objected to Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations precisely because it seemed like it would involve the United States in the system of power politics centered in Europe, which is precisely what both nationalists and internationalists wanted to avoid. So then I started to turn to subsequent years. And so for me, it became a question, when did isolationism as a category actually get used? How was it invented? Who used that category? Because there's a grain of truth, you might say, in that category, which is that the United States had, since the very founding of the Republic, sought to avoid what Thomas Jefferson construed as entanglements in the old world, in old world power politics. Now, that view licensed vast expansion and conquest in the so-called New World across North America. Then the United States took colonies in Puerto Rico and the Philippines. So by no means was the United States pacifist or even pacifistic throughout its history. And yet there was a consensus very widely held at the elite level, at the popular level, across the parties, that surely the United States had no interest entering into the system of power politics in Eurasia. What happened there essentially did not impinge upon the vital interests, the safety of Americans in North America. And so even someone like Woodrow Wilson argued that the League of Nations would be a disentangling alliance and not actually have to involve the projection of US military power on a routine basis. So from that perspective, Woodrow Wilson was an isolationist, except that makes no sense at all. He wasn't an isolationist. In fact, no one was, and nobody said that they were an isolationist, even in the 1930s. So it was in the 1930s, using some methods of conceptual history inspired by Koselleck, though I don't get into that in the book. I wanted to know, how are these concepts generated? And so for me, what was important about the invention of isolationism as a category in the 1930s and the early 1940s was what it said about the people who were using that category. That is, the people who come to define themselves as internationalists of a new stripe, because they redefine internationalism against this pejorative coinage, isolationism. By doing that, internationalism takes its old resonance as a project of avoiding or transcending power politics and yokes that idea to the new project of the United States dominating power politics. So it allows this kind of contradictory argument to look like it makes perfect sense. It's perfectly coherent, because against isolationism, one can argue for the projection of American power and make it seem like really this is all about having a decent world and achieving international cooperation.
Yeah, and actually, it's very helpful to the story, I would say, to have this background in the interwar period in a way, because of course I'm used to, like people in the audience will be, to looking at the interwar period from a German perspective and thinking about what led to what, basically, and to a different and yet comparable outcome in a way. And from the American perspective, the 1920s are so interesting because in a way I think there's so many components of them that are pretty overlooked, and in a way it's like the world had blinked and America had completely transformed, and from this rising power of the 19th century, which people had under radar, of course, but which was still a bit in the shadow of Europe. And then suddenly after the Second World War, it is the dominant superpower overshadowing everything, basically, and then into the Cold War. And I was wondering if you think there are comparable dynamics in today's society and political thinking to the 1920s, or is that a drawn out comparison? Is there something to be said about that, or is it a stretch too far?
I'm not sure. So the claim that was advanced in the past 5 years frequently was that Donald Trump represented a reversion to so-called American isolationism of the 1920s or 30s. And that much, I think, is wrong. President Trump, I mean, what defined the people who were called isolationists in that period, in the interwar period, was that they put a hemispheric limitation on the commitment and use of military force. So thus, they didn't think that the United States had to be forward deployed or make commitments to use force in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, the Eurasian landmass altogether. Donald Trump never said anything of the sort. Instead, he portrayed a world full of enemies of the United States out to take advantage of the United States. The twist was that he could cast US allies as part of the so-called globalist forces that were exploiting the United States. But he never had a kind of theory of American interests that underpinned his strategy. And that's why, as president, it's not, and I should also add, he always argued that he would build up the US military, which indeed he did, spending more on the US military, such that I believe now the United States spends more on its military than the next 11 countries combined. So an isolationist, he was not even a caricature, like not even in the mold of the figures from the 1920s and 30s. Now, I do think that the 20s and 30s featured a rise in American nativism. This is a time when the Ku Klux Klan, for example, had a real resurgence. And that does seem relevant to recent times, but the relationship between that and US foreign policy is not easy to tease out, either then or now.
Actually, because you mentioned hemispheres already, I would like to jump to that, because thinking in hemispheres is quite interesting. And this phrase, geography is destiny, of course, went through my mind reading about this thinking, and thinking about a country that's so large that it can think in hemispheres, basically, when determining its foreign policy. And it's very interesting to read about the machinations and calculations in the period before America decided to get into the war, after all. And there's so much thinking about trade and with whom can we trade, how much trade do we have to do with South America to scale off with what Germany will take from us, and so on, which is very rational in a way that's a bit hard to deal with from today's perspective. There's also thinking about security, of course, in terms of hemisphere. Quartersphere is also a term that's come up. And I was wondering how you would compare and contrast, on the one hand, this very rational, very cold, is maybe a stupid word, but the very cold-blooded thinking about what should we do with this war? Is it serving any kind of national interest? With America's strong sense of destiny of itself, which of course had to develop and change for the times, with this kind of idealistic idea, which was also coursing through the administration that got into the war after all.
That's a wonderful question. So you're right that both the kind of hard-headed calculations of what America's security and economy required, and these effusive, moralistic statements are put forward at once, often by the same people, in my account. And I ultimately don't think that they lead to different places. So chapter 2 of my book goes through this remarkable sequence in the wake of the fall of France in the summer of 1940 into October. And post-war planners who were working on behalf of the State Department, then in the Council on Foreign Relations, one group of those planners tried to ask the question, you know, assuming that the Axis powers rule Europe, and perhaps a little bit more than Europe, and possibly even Great Britain, for the foreseeable future, how much of the world does the United States need to protect for its security and prosperity? So at first they test out, as you mentioned, the quarter sphere, which would extend an area that would extend from North America. So it would include Canada down to the place where Brazil bulges out into the Atlantic. And at that point, it seemed like that might just be the most the United States military could defend. The US had to actually build up its military dramatically, merely to be able to defend the Western Hemisphere in a newly hostile world. So basically everybody in the United States, once France fell, agreed to a dramatic military buildup. And the question became, for what? What would the United States do with that military? And the planners come to conclude that, you know, actually the US economy might do just fine with a quarter sphere, but it wouldn't be ideal. And after all, the United States has this historic attachment to the Monroe Doctrine that most people understand commits the United States to keep Europeans out of the Western Hemisphere. So let's consider the hemisphere as a unit. And as they make that decision, the Roosevelt administration makes clear that it's going to at least defend the entire Western Hemisphere. In fact, many of the non-interventionists, the people who gathered under the banner of America First, also wanted the United States to defend the entire Western Hemisphere. So the quarter sphere wasn't a real option. And then they, you know, ran some more numbers based on trade statistics and found that, you know, if the United States wanted to make no compromise whatsoever with liberal capitalism, so it wouldn't try to regiment trade, but rather expand the area, so it wouldn't need to trade much with a potential Axis-dominated Europe, it would really be best if the United States was the leader of essentially the rest of the world, aside from the Axis sphere. And that's the conclusion that these planners come to in the fall of 1940. But, you know, I think you have to ask, was this really a kind of scientific enterprise? Because the premise of the exercise was that the United States should enjoy, its system of liberal capitalism with as little compromise as possible, that it should defend the entire Western Hemisphere at a minimum, in accordance with its traditional Monroe Doctrine. And then I think there was a further concern that the United States should continue to be a kind of light unto the world and satisfy this exceptionalist sense of itself, to be the leading power, at least in shaping the basic future of the world. And so that even these economists in the Council on Foreign Relations, when they did their calculations, they wanted to make sure that the United States-led area would have greater bargaining power than the Axis-led area centered in Europe. So the United States would still be in an advantageous position. So at the end of the day, you know, I think it'd be fair to ask whether these cold-blooded calculations were in fact designed to, you know, maximally satisfy more grandiose aspirations on the part of the United States, ones that, under the circumstances, I have sympathy with, to be clear, but nevertheless, ones that are extremely expansive and therefore dovetail with others, with President Roosevelt and other public commentators like Walter Lippmann, who were talking about how the United States, because of its sense of destiny, couldn't be left isolated in an Axis-led world, but rather needed to be now abandoning its old reluctance to get entangled in faraway problems in order to satisfy its kind of traditional longing to be driving world history forward.
Yeah, and because you have already mentioned it, part of the machinations and calculations that were done before entering the war were to do with how to handle a victorious Germany, which would have taken over most of the continent. Maybe Britain, that seems to be in the book a bit of the point of being on the brink of things, thinking about what happens if Britain falls too. And of course, this is a bit bone-chilling to read as a German for once, but it's also, I think it's bringing up questions of, is this delusional? Is it more rational than a layman can get a sense of? Because of course the Americans saw what happened to the people who trusted what the Nazis said about the limits of what they wanted to do in Europe, and how secure could American government officials be that there wouldn't be something they couldn't foresee in the future, and they could really live with victorious Germany for decades with the technological progress to come as well, of course. Do you have any sense of that?
You know, I think in this area, American officials and post-war planners were pretty rational. They did not think that Nazi ambitions could be tamed. So for the first half of 1941, what they envisioned, as the United States was abandoning any pretense of neutrality, by the way, and extending large amounts of lend-lease aid to Great Britain and eventually the Soviet Union. So what they envisioned was a kind of post-war Cold War, an armed stalemate with an Axis-led Europe, where, you know, there wouldn't be any real peace. But they envisioned the United States partnering with the Anglophone world, with Britain and mostly the white British settler dominions in the British Commonwealth, to engage in a kind of post-war standoff with an Axis-led Europe. And remember, at this time, the neutrality pact between Germany and the Soviet Union was in force. So many Americans imagined that the Soviet Union was de facto aligned with the Axis powers, the triple axis thus providing the specter of a kind of unified threat across Eurasia. If anything, that that projection proved to be pessimistic because, of course, I believe we're speaking on the anniversary of Operation Barbarossa today. Oh. Because that operation happened, it was in fact not going to be very likely that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were going to remain long at peace. And so the specter of this kind of unified force, at least being able to maintain power and keep pushing outward from the Eurasian landmass, diminished over the second half of 1941 and beyond. And yet at that point, instead of taking this as news that the United States could return after the war to its prior position of defending the Western Hemisphere, the US post-war planners decided, well, great, we will now expand the area that the United States should lead from the non-German world to essentially the whole world, now imagining that Axis power could be rolled back on the continent of Europe itself.
Before I would like to jump to what happened after the war, because that's of course a very important part of the book, I would like to say to the audience that you can already type questions into the chat, and at the very end I will read a few of them to Stephen. But if you want to collect your thoughts, you can already type, and I will choose and read out in the end. So at the point of the war being won, of course, by the Allies, what you described has already happened. The decision has been made, of course, to turn the United States to the global superpower, enforcing its dominance with military aims and all over the world, basically. And that's what we still live with, of course. And I would like to know, was there ever, once the decision had been made, and it was made in an elite circle of people who were very good at their job, I must say, for not being in a very big or powerful department at that point, as I've already mentioned, was there any point where things could have turned back with the Cold War advancing, or is this just forward momentum up until at least 1989?
Yeah, what I would emphasize is that whereas a lot of scholars have debated the origins of the Cold War and taken the second half of the 1940s to be the pivotal time when the United States became a fully fledged global superpower, I think that so much of what happened at that time was already established by the end of World War II in 1945, when in October of 45, Harry Truman could stand before the Congress and say, as a matter of course, that the United States would maintain superiority after the war on land and sea and in the air. Now, the question remained how to do that. And I do think that it was conceivable that the United States might not forward deploy so many members of its armed forces in Europe, leaving aside the post-war occupation duties. I mean, the formation of NATO takes years to happen. And there was a demand in the United States for a peace dividend and for demobilization. The ranks of the army contracted much more quickly than American leaders wanted, in part because of mutinies. by American service members who wanted to go home and didn't understand why that wasn't happening. So, you know, I don't want to take away from the contingencies of the later story, but I do want to emphasize that whereas the moment of victory in World War II is often remembered as what the historian Elizabeth Borgward calls a multilateral moment, when Americans looked forward to cooperating with the world, even the Soviet Union, on a kind of equal basis as part of what we would now, or some people would now call a post-war US-led rules-based international order, a phrase of relatively recent vintage. You know, if you look at history by running it forward, not reading it backward, and you look closely at what leading Americans were saying in 1944 and 1945, what you see is a clear priority put on the United States projecting armed force on a routine basis to ensure a favorable distribution of power wherever the distribution of power may seriously be affected. And that's totally different from its old hemispheric restriction on the use of political and military commitments. And so, although it remains a question, exactly what does the United States maintaining a preponderance of power require in the actual world? That basic assumption of what US responsibilities are remains in force from that moment to I think our present.
That's actually a good point in the end, because I wanted to mention, I've already did so in German, but that you're also a prolific commentator on current events, not just on history, and you write a lot in magazines and for websites about what's been going on in foreign policy right now, not just in the decades previously. Of course, that informs what you write about. And much of it, I think, is, if I may break it down, is based on the idea that America's military omnipresence and dominance, of course, shouldn't be just an eternal end unto itself. So it shouldn't just go on forever unquestioned, because that's how it's always been, and nothing as bad as the Second World War has happened under it. So it must be good how it is. And what I find quite interesting is how much friction that that actually makes, especially for people in Europe and Germany. And you've talked to Franziska Brandner, one of the leading green experts on foreign policy, and it's been quite interesting to keep up on European reactions to your work. And of course, Germans get quite scared when America thinks about maybe getting the troops back and maybe taking a bit less interest and active part in what's been going on the continent. And I'm wondering, should we just face the fears, or should we just learn to be more proactive and think about ourselves in a more grown-up way? What's your recipe for us?
Well, I don't mean to give a recipe for anyone except perhaps the people in the town behind me, which is Washington, D.C. You know, I see the story that I tell in the book as a kind of tragedy, where it makes perfect sense to me that in a moment of the kind of greatest triumph of the United States, a moment of redefinition of what America was to itself and in the world, World War II, that the overhang of that war leads us, I think, astray in our own time. Now, if you look at what prompted American officials and intellectuals at that time to make a decision in favor of global military dominance. It was the specter of a totalitarian order that could attain great power through armed conquest and effectively close off major centers of the world to the influence and exchange of Americans and other American-style liberal people. And so that kind of basic logic applies through the Cold War, where the Soviet Union slots into the place that the Axis powers had occupied in the American imagination. That's quite coherent. Where I think the project becomes incoherent is after 1991, after the totalitarian great powers collapsed. The United States continued to believe that it should pursue global military dominance. And in fact, US alliances and military positions only expanded from that time onward, with NATO expansion being one example. And that, I think, has been a mistake. And I think what the United States ought to have done in the 1990s, and there was no better time and will be no better time to have done it, is to pull back, to recognize that the world has a chance to not be so divided. And that includes Russia. And others should take the initiative to determine for themselves what their security requires, without the United States being the dominant power. And if you take the case of Europe, the United States has not only decided to be the dominant military power and a dominant figure in European security matters through the vehicle of NATO, it's also suppressed European initiatives to become more autonomous from the 1990s onward, when those initiatives were floated by various governments. So, you know, my view is that it would be clearly beneficial for US security, for the US to hand off, make a security transition from US leadership to European leadership in the defense of Europe. I don't think this can go on forever. I also don't think it's too late, that we've missed the moment, the opportunity that existed earlier in the 1990s, even given the reality of Russia today, which isn't a cheery reality, but at least Russia does not have the capability to overrun Europe in any scale remotely similar to what the Soviet Union with its Red Army and Warsaw Pact could do. So that's broadly the direction in which I think things should head. And I think I would worry very much about the United States as prospects of conflict, real armed conflict with Russia or others intensify, as they already are, over the future. I would worry about some of the same pathologies that we've seen applied to the Middle East over the last 2 decades coming to affect European security, not to mention a potentially quite dangerous competition with China in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, actually, before I want to give people from the chat a chance, that's what where I wanted to end, maybe in a 2-part question. One would be, of course, someone from the notorious blob from the military-industrial complex in Washington would argue that, well, the competition with China is already there. It's it's very intense, of course. It won't get much better or friendlier anytime soon. And at least what the Cold War, in a way, brought to US society was a certain coherence, because there's an enemy on the outside. And I think you can already tell in President Biden's rhetoric. Of course, he's not someone who talks like Donald Trump, we all know that, but I think he's very deliberate in talking about China in a way that at least tries to unify Americans against someone from beyond the borders. And I'm wondering, is that something that you considered and just don't agree with? Is that something to which you would ascribe a different outcome in the end? Will it just not work, or is it maybe even dangerous? And if I may tag this onto this, you've commented in the past on this idea of foreign policy as something that American elections and electorates not really think about much, and it's not part of election campaigns a lot. And I was wondering if you think that this intense focus on military and security as parts of foreign policy, as superpower politics, if that really overshadows other kinds of international cooperation and foreign policy that would be much more relevant to the 21st century.
Yeah, I think those questions are related insofar as the challenges internationally that are most likely to adversely affect the American public, where Americans live and work, are climate change and pandemic disease. And if one clearly prioritizes those challenges, those threats over others, it does create a serious need to have some cooperation with China and on as wide a basis as possible. Now, I do think that competition with China isn't going away, and in some respects is justified. In terms of, I talked about making a security transition in Europe. Well, I didn't mean that the United States and Europe shouldn't work together on setting standards, integrating economies, cooperating on climate change and other challenges. To some degree, more cooperation is called for. And I think that's the kind of thing that can meaningfully constrain Chinese action where it most counts. But the Chinese military threat is quite a bit less substantial than the kind of challenges it has posed to date economically and technologically. And it's of a very different magnitude to the challenges of the Axis powers or Soviet-backed communism. The fact is, and this may change in the future, and so this bears watching very closely how Chinese intentions and capabilities change if and as its growth economically continues. But right now, with the exception of Taiwan, which bears a special relationship to mainland China, the threat of China going on a rampage of conquest is not one that I think anyone thinks is very great. And so that suggests that the wisest course would make a distinction, a clear distinction between competition and confrontation with China in economic and technological realms and military competition with China. And what I observe is that the United States, many in the American foreign policy making community, are lumping all these challenges together. And so are American leaders in Congress and now a few presidents. So that, I think, is a wager, as you've alluded to. It's kind of a wager that maybe fear of a foreign enemy can help to heal the deep divides of Americans domestically. But I would worry about that wager going wrong.
Yeah.
Instead, for decades, fear of foreign enemies, right, one of which attacked the United States horrifically on September 11th, 20 years ago, hasn't brought America together, despite the idea that it would, which George W. Bush articulated after 9/11, as did many others. Rather, it has stirred up more and more division, and I would argue even helped to foster a nativist and populist revolt in the United States. So, and let's remember, the original Cold War wasn't done as some kind of self-conscious scheme to discipline American society and bring about progress. It was done because of the threat of Soviet domination in Europe and then in East Asia. So I would worry about those who want to make a wager and who even appreciate, the limited military threat that China poses to the United States, but think that this is a way to bring about unity in Congress and maybe further down in society.
I've picked two questions from the chat as maybe our road to the end of the event. And Hannah asks you, as you said in your book, the US grew into its hegemonial position primarily against the fascist Nazi regime and then in juxtaposition to the communist Soviets. How do you assess the developments of China and their position within this historically grown global context? I think a little bit was in your previous answer already.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I will say that I think that the way the rise of China is being understood and mobilized in the United States has a lot to do with this history. I think there is a kind of self-conscious attempt to place China into the role of the Axis powers and the Soviet Union. And the question is whether that doesn't become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If the United States tries to make countries choose economically and technologically between the United States and China, that will actually, I think, in the long term, risk actual armed conflict and territorial conquest, because right now we've actually achieved something remarkable in the wider scope of history, which is that it doesn't get you very much if you're a state to actually control other people's territory. You can engage in other ways, and those are the ones that are most meaningful. But if we divide the world through decoupling and forced decoupling upon other states into different systems, then it will become very important to control more territory, both for them and for us. So I would worry about a self-fulfilling prophecy if China does get a lot worse in its behavior and truly does seem to merit the kind of treatment once given to the Soviet Union, then that's important. But let's not jump the gun. And I think these kind of alarms that are repeatedly issued now by a number of leaders suggesting that China is bent on world domination and, is maybe almost there. That shows, I think, less about Chinese activity, particularly in the military realm, than it does about this conception of American world leadership and how it creates a sense of threat that otherwise didn't need to be there.
And actually, the last question by Mohammed is pretty perfect as a tag onto that. I'm going to ask a topical question. Doesn't the democratic system that is put forward by the American president with regard to China help to strengthen the position of Chinese power, since democracy has not brought prosperity to many parts of the world, in Africa, Latin America, etc.? What do you think of that? A question.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I am skeptical. As I've said, I think there are good reasons to be wary of Chinese power and to compete with China. I think that's inevitable, in fact. But you know, the administration does seem to want to frame the contest in terms of democracy versus authoritarianism, even though China's not doing a great deal to propagate its own system as a model to others. And indeed, it's hard to see exactly how its rather remarkable growth trajectory is easy to replicate by other countries. So I think here too, there might be a risk of a self-fulfilling prophecy in which, by putting the credibility of the democratic system on the line in this contest, it could alienate others around the world from democracy. And I think, frankly, that was one of the underappreciated consequences of the war on terror, originally being cast as a struggle to spread democracy, a struggle against tyranny. And one reaction to that could be, well, if this is what it means, if this is what democracy stands for, then so much for democracy. Now, I believe in democracy. That's not what should happen. But when we mix together idealistic goals with hard-headed strategic pursuits, it's a dangerous game.
Yeah, it is. Actually, that brings us, I think, to a very round and informative end. There's been a tour de force through the last and this century, I think. Before we end, and I'm going to thank you all, I'm going to switch to German for next week's program, just for one sentence. Nächste Woche am Dienstag haben wir Norina Hertz zu Gast zum erstmal letzten Transatlantic Tuesday, eine der führenden Ökonominnen und Globalisierungskritikerin, die uns The Lonely Century vorstellen wird, ihr Buch über Einsamkeit als moderne Pandemie, könnte man sagen. Und ich möchte Sie auch noch darauf hinweisen, dass wir ab Juli einen Podcast starten, Carl & Company. Da wird Susie Hansen, Pulitzer-Finalistin und auch Außenpolitik-Expertin, zu Gast sein. Wenn es Ihnen heute Abend gefallen hat, können Sie uns gerne einen Unkostenbeitrag von 5 € überweisen. Die Rechnungsdaten sind in der E-Mail, über die Sie sich angemeldet haben. And with that, and now my mouth is really dry, I want to thank at first all the people who've use this summer evening to engage with American policy and history. Thank you so much for being here with us. It's been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for your questions. And most of all, I want to thank Stephen Wertheim here on the first day of his new, very fancy job. Thank you so much for being here, Stephen. It's been a pleasure and I've learned a lot.
This was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everybody for attending and asking some very stimulating questions.
And last thing, the book is Tomorrow the World, and you can order it not only from Amazon, but also from local bookstores, as I did here in Germany. Thank you and have a good night. Goodbye.